We are very excited to have Alex Andreou and Vicky Pryce with us tonight. Who better than this duo to unpack whether we're living through a Greek tragedy or a farce? And what could possibly happen next? Um, if you haven't been before, Radix Big Tent is a think tank. It is the result of a merger between Radix UK and the Big Tent. We provide a platform for those outside the political mainstream to influence policy. And we provide these sorts of discussions on a regular basis. So we hope to see you all again. Vicky Pryce is one of the country's most eminent economists. But more importantly, she is also chair of the fellows at Radix Big Tent. Over to you, Vicky.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction, and really great to see so many of you here at a time when it is really for many a holiday period. So thank you very much. So it is great to have Alex here with us today. I mean, Alex is, as you probably can gather from his name, Greek, as I am. In fact, I'm speaking to you from Greece right now, although Alex comes from a slightly more exciting place than me. I'm from Athens and he's from Mykonos. A number of you perhaps have been there. It is an amazing island, but he's lived in the UK now for quite some time. And I got to know Alex because he does a podcast called The Quiet Riot. And I've been interviewed a few times by him on that. And in fact, I think it was Mark Robinson who had heard one of our fellows, and suggested that perhaps Alex would be the person to also, become one of our interviewees, if you like, for the series that we've been having now for quite some time, almost a monthly series of interviews. Now, of course, what it is that we're going to be talking about today, and there have been already questions about whether we do things right, I mean, whether it's a farce or a tragedy, is this mix of economics, one of the things that Alex does very well in his podcast, and politics. And of course, we're better to look at what we can learn from the past than the Greek myths and everything that the ancient Greeks had run. I do say to my kids that the Greeks invented everything, and it is all Greek, and not all Greek to me, but all Greek. They get very annoyed with me. In fact, the odd child of mine is listening right now, but I was right all along. I just want to make that point. The Greeks had invented it all. So Alex runs this fantastic podcast called Podyssey. I think you can talk to us a little bit about that, Alex. And I think it is because of that we were thinking that the link between the ancient world and the modern world is the right one to explore right now. Do you want to say a little bit about where you're coming from in this entire sort of area of thinking about how to link the two?
Sure. I hope everyone can see me and hear me. So the idea for Podyssey came really from a conversation that I was having with some fellow panelists in a political podcast, where I was asked about Boris Johnson's classical allusions and how accurate they were, and it always bugged me that he would compare himself to figures like Pericles, when there are other much more appropriate myths in the canon, as it were, that were much, much better suited to him, and we'll come to talk about some of those later, I'm sure. And so I did a little episode with a political journalist called Ian Dunt, and he was quizzing me about these myths and how they applied to Boris Johnson. And we had an extraordinary response to that episode. Loads of people online saying, can we just have Alex telling us stories from ancient Greece, please? That's the podcast I want to subscribe to. And so that's where the idea was born. And then when I started thinking about how to structure Podyssey, cleverly named, you see, because it's a pod, but it's also a sort of endless journey, an odyssey, a Podyssey. So when I started thinking about it, I started thinking, how do I want to structure it? Do I want it to be a panel discussion? Do I want to just be me narrating a heavily scripted thing? Do I want to involve other people with expertise? Because I'm not a historian. I'm not an archaeologist. I'm not in any of those classically connected disciplines. But I do have an archaeologist and a historian. I have an art critic and a psychotherapist on the podcast that I draw on for various bits of their expertise. And so the podcast was born, and partly as a joke, we thought we'd put together the pilot episode would be about Narcissus, because Donald Trump was about to take over in America. This was in January, and everyone thought it was a very funny idea to do an episode that explained what narcissism is. And so I started researching the story of Narcissus and realized that you can't tell the story of Narcissus unless you also tell the story of Echo, who is the sort of dryad that fell in love with him and pursued him. And as I went into it and did my research, I realized that, first of all, Narcissus was not a narcissist. So it's completely unfair to taint him with that brush. And secondly, that his story is not one that particularly applies to Trump, but it is one that particularly applies to Elon Musk, because Narcissus turns out to be all about getting lost in that reflective pool where everyone is giving you back the validation that you want, and all you can see is your filtered, ideal image, and you get lost in it and drawn into it, and eventually you drown in it. And so
because this is what happened in the story, isn't it?
Yeah, because
so explain what happened to both of them.
So Narcissus does not willingly fall in love with his own reflection. In fact, he doesn't even know it is his own reflection. He's a complete innocent in the story. He's just a teenager who's basically not yet interested in sex. But because he's so pretty, everyone fancies him, and people sort of offer themselves on a plate to him, and he goes, no thanks. He's a left swiper by nature. And so one of them takes this obsession to the max and ends up taking his own life. And with his dying breath, he asks Nemesis, who is the Greek deity of she's a deity of justice, but it's more specific than that. She's a deity that restores balance, basically, that punishes hubris, that says, we gave you a gift and you squandered it. So this
is what we need right now, really.
Yeah, yes.
I mean, so I would say that we need one of them, please.
Oh, yes. I mean, I would go straight to the Furies, to be honest. I think we're way past Nemesis. I think we need to go straight to the deities that hound people. And so Nemesis curses him to fall in love with his own reflection. He's not a willing participant. He like I said, he doesn't even know it's happening. It's the result of a divine curse. And so to say that he is the person that is obsessed with himself it's not fair. What he is an innocent teenager that's not ready yet to give himself to the world sexually, but for whom the world is very much ready. And that constant rejection. And this is one of the themes that has actually cropped up in every single myth that I've looked at. The ancient Greeks were very heavily into the balance of the natural divine. They really were very, very keen. Oh, what's going on? I do.
Like a child.
Yeah, I do occasionally have that effect on an audience. So So, ancient Greek mythology and theology is all about balancing nature and divinity. And so the refusal of Narcissus to give himself to other people, to share his beauty, to share his youth, is seen as the sin that Nemesis punishes, essentially. And what happens to both him and Echo is that they both get quite literally reabsorbed into nature. They melt back into nature as if the natural world is saying, if you're not using the physical body that we've given you, then we will have it back, please.
It's interesting because obviously we all think, particularly politicians, as being the greatest narcissists around.
Yeah.
And that you've got to be that to be a politician. And of course, we think of Trump and we think of others. There is a question about Boris Johnson. Of course, we're not going to be sort of attacking individual politicians,
no, nor diagnosing them, which is.
Yeah. But sorry, what did you say, Alex?
Nor diagnosing them remotely, which is again.
Not diagnosing. I mean, we can't diagnose them ourselves necessarily. We need to know an awful lot more. But there is something. I mean, the Greek, the classics. There's so much there that we can use as comparators, if you like, with what's going on right now. But there is a question that says, Boris Johnson was using classical words. I mean, Latin and ancient Greek all the time. Is that put us off? The credibility of using classical aphorisms in politics? Is this the sort of thing that we should discourage politicians to be doing? Because of course, the way they use them, people don't quite understand what they mean. And as you rightly said, what the ancient Greeks wrote in their myths, or the myths anyway that were perpetuated in people's imaginations, weren't necessarily always correctly interpreted in the modern world.
No, and they've also been twisted. They've been through
Alex.
Yeah. So they've often been twisted, in fact, deliberately to change their meaning over the millennia. And so, I'm not against people using classical allusions. It would be ridiculous to say that because they have an understanding of them. Most people have an understanding of them, The sort of deep dive that I do is not necessarily to tell people off, to tell people you got this wrong, shame on you. Every story has a headline, and the headline lends itself to various moral lessons. So the headline for Narcissus is young man falls in love with own reflection. That is the headline, and that will attract a particular kind of comment, right? But it's not what's the substance of the myth, I guess. So I'm not against Johnson or anyone else using classical allusions if it makes people curious. If it makes people curious and it means that people, go and look up what that myth is and what it means and, what its sources are, I'm all for it.
Okay, well, can we then now see the relevance of some of the myths to today's politicians? We've already said that perhaps narcissism isn't quite the right word to use, but obviously there must be all sorts of things that we get from the myths, which maybe give us some idea of how some things might end. The politics right now, wars. You have something about Midas as well. Do you want to talk about that and see how you can get sort of the relevance of the Midas myth, for example?
Yeah.
Was it Trump you were perhaps
yes,
thinking
Midas was entirely Trump. When I started looking into them, not only that, Trump has actually written a book about business called The Midas Touch, where he explains what each digit of a hand stands for in business. It's utter gumph, essentially, but that is the legend he has chosen for himself, and you see it in his everyday life. He lives in this golden penthouse. He's little by little kitting out the Oval Office to have more and more gilded things around him so that it looks more and more like a palace. He's someone that likes that kind of shiny ostentation. And he's very, very close to the Midas myth. But what's interesting about the Midas myth is that it was a cautionary tale. You know, we now say he's got the Midas touch as if that is a great thing, as if someone has the ability to turn everything into gold. But the ability to turn everything into gold was not a good thing in the myth. You know, he ended up turning his own child into a gold statue and had to beg the gods to lift this curse from him. He went to the river Pactolus and washed the curse away to return everything to what it had been before. And afterwards, he keeps making poor choices. So he ends up judging a musical contest between Apollo and Pan, chooses Pan over Apollo, so he gets ass's ears as a reward for his troubles, and then has to strike some sort of deal with his barber to keep his secret. He wears a turban for the rest of his days, and the only person that knows that he in fact has the ears of a donkey is his barber. And so, you know, and so he's a figure of fun. And I guess this takes us to the very, very top question of this session. Is this tragedy or is it farce? And the answer is it's both, because it is always both. It's never just one thing instead of another. It is always many, many things at once. Tragedy and farce forever go together, because what your experience as farce, as an audience looking in, is tragedy for the people involved. And so the people in it, what is happening is completely serious and deadly. But to you, looking in from the outside, it's comical and farcical. And part of that is the notion that, oh, thank heavens this isn't happening to me. Only we're looking at the world around us today, and it is happening to us. And I guess the question is, how do the principles inside the comedy, inside the tragedy, inside the farce, how can we affect what's going on in order to shift its trajectory in a way, to make it go in a different direction?
Is there anything in the myths? Alex, is there anything in the myths that gives us this hope? I mean, you do have a very interesting one from Aesop's Fables, which has, you know, shows that what you ask for as a nation of your leaders is more or less what you get.
Yeah.
Or you've got to be careful what you ask for. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, Aesop was a really fascinating one to do, because it's an investigation on two levels. One is his fables, but the other one is the fable of his life, because that's also completely made up. So it's called the Aesop romance. People have written they've constructed a biography of Aesop that is completely false. It is not based on any historical fact, basically. They have made him have disabilities and dwarfism, and he's mute in some versions and blind in some versions. He's old, he's incredibly unpleasant to look at, but he has this extraordinary ability to conjure tales that make people around them understand the truth of the universe, basically. And some of his fables have fallen out of fashion, and you can kind of see why they have fallen out of fashion. And there is one in particular about leadership, about what we want from leaders. And it is a fable about the frogs and the god Zeus. So the frogs petition Zeus to give them a king. They go to Zeus and they say, we can't decide anything amongst ourselves. Please give us someone that will make the decisions for us. And Zeus is annoyed at them, and he takes a log, just a dead piece of wood, and throws it in the pool where they live. And they get very frightened from the splash, and they go and hide away. And hours pass and days pass, and the log just sits there and does nothing. And little by little, they come out from hiding, and then they end up sitting on top of the log, and they go, well, this is no king, is it? And so they go back to Zeus, and they said, can we have a proper king that, is hands-on and takes action? And he says, sure, whatever you want. And so he sends them a pelican that sits in the middle of the pool, and every time a frog goes up to him, he swallows the frog, eats him up. And they go back to Zeus and they said, come on, why are you doing this to us? All we asked for was someone to rule us. And Zeus says to them, this is it. These are the two kinds of rulers you can get. One that is useless and one that eats you up alive. So you didn't like the first kind, so I sent you the second kind. And it's really difficult for me today, in 2025, to be reading that fable and not instantly to think, well, it's Biden and then Trump. It's a sort of sleepy, inactive, vaguely benevolent person being replaced by someone that is very hands-on and very active, but actually does an immense amount of damage around him. And so, maybe the answer is effectively this kind of think tank, right? Maybe the answer is civic organizations, civil society. Maybe the answer is to organize amongst themselves so that we can do as much as we can do by ourselves before we go to a state entity and say, can you sort this for us? Because we're incapable of sorting it out. So maybe the answer is, and again, we had Christina Pagel on the podcast this week, and she was talking about this incredible index she's putting together of all the authoritarian actions that the Trump regime has taken from its first day on. And what we came to understand is that the only people who have been able to resist Trump effectively in the States are workers' unions and civil rights organizations, because they were already in place, because they pre-existed and they had practiced this thing and they knew what they were doing, so they could take legal action. They knew what to do and how to do it. And so I guess the moral of that story for us is that we need to beef up and strengthen our civil rights organizations, our civic infrastructure from the bottom up now, before we need it. Because if we get to the stage where we do need it, it's almost already too late to do it. It's too late to put a resistance together once this kind of authoritarianism is already on top of you. We need to prepare now. And we really do need to prepare, because if you think that America, with its federal structure, with its Supreme Court, with its constitution, if this can happen to America in the space of 6 months, what can happen here in the space of 6 months if some malevolent person at the top decides that they don't care for the good chap theory of government? Johnson tested that to a certain extent, but he was still working within a party structure that could actually eject him when he went too far. What happens if, let's say, and I'm not using this to specifically victimize Nigel Farage, but Nigel Farage operates in a party that is much more like a private company, and it's much more autocratic in its structure. What he says goes. He's an emperor in that castle. So what happens if someone like that takes over and decides they want to dismantle things like civil rights? What is our response?
But Alex, in the myths, there is occasionally retribution. As you said, the gods intervene and do various things, perhaps punish people, maybe not always for the right reasons. And there is a question which has got loads of people saying that they'd like to hear the answer from Lydia Hume, which says sort of Greek myths, they gave us sort of ethical and cautionary tales to learn from. And indeed, there is some some consequences of bad behavior, possibly. But what do we do when our leaders display similar traits and they don't seem to suffer the consequences? Well, actually, you mentioned Boris Johnson, but Boris Johnson did in the end. But here we are today, having just learned a few more things about this leak of all those names, the Afghan names and so on. I mean, people didn't know, and we didn't know until today. There were loads and loads of UK military individuals whose names were also on the list. So in other words, we are blind to what is happening. And you and I, when we were discussing this before, also talked about the social media, which again is being mentioned by Sophie, which is, quite an important part of how it influences what we understand about reality. And how do we get over this? I think there are going to be quite a lot of questions on this, I'm sure, when we open up. But that is one of the main concerns that everybody has. Do we understand enough of what's happening in order to be able to react? What do the myths tell us? What do the ancient Greeks? What is the answer?
The answer is that in any case, the things that we think are great constructs of our age and civilization are blips in time. And I think understanding that actually gives an awful lot of comfort. I grew up across the water from the island of Delos. Now, the island of Delos was the center of Greece for almost a century and a half. It was a center for commerce. It was the most important religious site. Everyone rich had a villa there. It was basically the Mykonos of its time. It was the Ibiza of its time. It was the Cayman Islands of its time, because it had a lot to do with avoiding tax, hence the Delian League. But
yes,
100 years later,
nothing
100
changes.
years later, it was flattened. It didn't even exist. No one lived there. Sheep grazed there. And other things popped up that became the center of the next civilization and the new culture. And so I think we should take, even though that seems quite a bleak notion, we can take a lot of comfort from it, that things get born, they grow sometimes too big for themselves, and then they wither and they die, and something else takes the place.
I'm sorry, where's the comfort exactly, Alex? Why is that comfort? I'm sorry, I find it pretty worrying, actually.
Well, I mean, it's pretty worrying if you're a rich woman living in Delos at the time, but it's pretty comforting if you're a landowner in Samos across the water, which is about to bloom into a big center of commerce and culture, taking over from Samos, I guess. I guess what I'm saying is that as a species and as a civilization, we have offshoots that survive and thrive, even if what we see today as the great central flower comes to its natural withering period.
Well,
and that's what we're seeing. That's what we're seeing with America a little bit. America is the world's most famous liberal democracy, and it's right now going through a transformation into something else, into something quite dark, I think. And I'm not sure that it helps anyone to deny that is happening. I'm not sure it's particularly to anyone's benefit to say, oh, it's only 4 years, it'll pass. I mean, I have no confidence that there will be another fair and free election in America. It's a possibility. I'm not saying it will definitely not happen, but I'm saying that from what I see, there is an erosion that is so fast and so deliberate going on there that I watch quite breathlessly and ask myself, what will go next? What will happen next?
Well, I mean, it will be interesting to see whether, again, the myths tell us something. But just to interject a second, that on Delos, of course, which we all think was a great sort of center of civilization, it was also the slave trade center.
Absolutely, the center of the slave.
So I think I heard that on a daily basis in the market square, 10,000 slaves would be sold on a day, in the day, which is extraordinary when you come to think of it. And of course, all the things have been imitated, if you like, sort of later by all of us. As you were saying, civilizations change, but the interesting thing for me is that we take a lot of the things that used to happen before. I mean, admittedly, the slave trade doesn't exist anymore, but through the millennials, it was there. And there is still slave trading going on in various places that we don't necessarily talk about. But I think there is a question, before I open it up. I mean, it is interesting you mentioned Trump, and we mentioned him a few times, but there is a question from Jill Sutcliffe, which says that in the Greek mythology, I mean, Zeus represents the leadership. You have to trust, you trust. And now, of course, we know that trust is so low, including actually on government and politicians, but also on everything else practically. So trust has fallen. Athena was the goddess, God, forgive me, goddess of problem solving. She was very wise and so on. And then we have Dionysus, the god of individualism. I mean, the question was, are there leaders you already picked, of course, Trump, and we know your views on it. I mean, it's quite clear. But are there any that you can think of around the world that who could perhaps claim to be fulfilling that role that was there by those Greek gods in particular?
Yeah, there are many and there are none, because it's all a matter of distance and perspective. And I go back to something Aesop said, that a bleached piece of flotsam dancing on the waves from a distance looks like an incredibly interesting and worthwhile thing. But if you come close enough, you realize that it's a hollow, empty, completely useless piece of wood. And so I would say that we are very keen to project on other countries' leaders what we think of as leadership qualities. I mean, look at the lionizing that we engaged in with regard to Justin Trudeau or Jacinda Ardern, even while their popularity was plummeting actually in their own countries. Look at how well Starmer is treated internationally. Look at how, our House of Commons stood and applauded Macron, whose popularity back home could not be any lower. And so there are qualities in leaders that we admire and we project onto them that we would like to believe are there, they're present, but the fact is that all of them, they are a set of human beings with good points and bad points. They are a set of people with attributes and flaws. And the best thing you can do for ourselves is actually to not expect some divine retribution, to not expect. I saw another question about the Deus ex machina, that came down at the end of a tragedy, and I have to say late tragedy. So Deus ex machina is not there in Aeschylus's tragedies. He's not there in Sophocles' tragedies. He appears in Euripides' tragedies. And actually, Aristophanes takes the mickey out of Euripides because he says, you get to a point in your plots where you can't actually resolve them. You've tangled them up so much that you need some god to come down from a machine and sort everything out for you, because you're not a good enough writer, basically. And so the best thing for us is not to expect that some leader in the world, maybe someone that hasn't been identified yet or elected yet, will come along and lift us from our current situation. We are the masters of our own destiny. There are many, many things around us that we can't control, but there is a number of things around us that we can control. And the more we become involved in our community, in our local politics, in civil society, in civic organizations, the more we donate, the more we get involved with charity, the more we become, we get on the board of our local school, the more we actually make a difference to the world at large. That is the lesson, broadly speaking.
Well, that is a very good point. We're going to be opening up if everybody wants to cover themselves, if you like. So turn cameras on and then perhaps start asking questions. There is one thing I wanted to bring back to, it's all Greek, of course. I mean, politics is basically, comes from the word of politis, which means the citizens. So it's basically what you are arguing, which is that individuals should be able to frame what happens. And of course, economics, which I do, and you and I have spoken about it many times. It's also a Greek word, which is, it comes from minding or the rules of your home. I'm not suggesting we go back to the way Margaret Thatcher thought of it and says we should do for government finances what we do for our own homes, because it's a bit different.
Yes.
But nevertheless, you can see the links between them both very strongly. So here we are. I can now see more people, but a number of you have decided to remain clandestine, sort of hiding away, but never mind. So if anyone wanted to come in, I saw a few signs that you were agreeing with things that Alex was saying. If you can elaborate a bit more on your own knowledge, possibly, of what the Greek myths have been saying and relevance for today, or anything at all from the politics of today, we can then turn back to the Greek myths.
I can see that Lydia has a big hand up.
Oh, does she? It's possible. All right. Yes, Lydia.
Hello. Sorry, my daughter would like to ask a question.
Aha.
Is there a Greek myth that's really funny?
Is there? Sorry, can you say that again?
Is there a Greek myth that's just funny?
Well, most of them are, by the way, or many of them are. So, Alex, a funny one, please.
Yeah, I mean, the second half of the King Midas myth is hilarious. He, like I said, he chooses Pan's music over Apollo's music. So Apollo says, I think there must be something wrong with your ears. And suddenly up sprout these two donkeys' ears. And he spent the rest of his days trying to hide them. And the only person that knows his secret is his barber. But his barber cannot keep the secret. The secret keeps bubbling up in him. Every time he has a conversation with anyone, he wants to say, King Midas has the ears of a donkey. But he can't say it because he knows he'll be punished, his family will be punished. So he ends up going to a field in the middle of nowhere and digging a hole. And he leans over the hole and says into the hole, King Midas has the ears of a donkey, and then covers it all up and leaves. And up from that piece of earth grows a clump of reeds, a clump of bamboo grass. And every time the wind blows through it, anyone passing nearby hears the reeds whisper, King Midas has the ears of a donkey.
So there, I hope that satisfies you. And then there are more. I mean, they were meant to entertain, the myths, of course, but also warn and prophesize up to a point.
Yeah.
I suppose, but also keep people thinking about doing the right things. I mean, there's an element of that, isn't there, Alex? Sort of encouraging people to behave, if you like, or to watch out for things in civil society.
Like I said, the one pattern that keeps popping up is that it's about balance. It's about understanding that there are sides to everything. There are different ways to look at everything from different sides, and that it looks different. And so, I went into the myth of Persephone, for instance, having a really specific idea about what it was. The daughter of the goddess of fertility is snatched away by Hades and taken to the underworld. And it's all about women coming together and claiming back this daughter that's been taken away from them. But then again, as you look into the myth and as you realize that there are many, many layers to it, like archaeology, my archaeologist says that, archaeology is all about knowing when you found something. It's not just about what you find, but knowing what layer it was at. So they keep a sort of really detailed record as they go layer after layer after layer after layer, because it's important. Because if you find, a set of seeds in the bottom layer of something you're excavating, maybe they mean that that place was an agricultural site at some point in the past. But if you find a bunch of discarded seeds in the top layer of a taverna, as they were called, that you're excavating, then that means they are the discarded snacks that people used to have when they stood in there and, drank wine. And so it is all about everything having its proper place and understanding that everything has layers, and every layer, it both obscures what's underneath it, but also reveals what's underneath it. It helps you understand what's underneath it. You can't do one without the other.
Do you think that the current voters or polluters, citizens, do understand this multi-layer issue, or are we seeing things too much in black and white now, with, there's only one way to the right or one way to the left, and so it's very binary, and you don't actually see the sort of all sorts of other possibilities that can be understood, if you like, if you start lifting them, or even just listen to the noise a little bit more, which I think is what those myths encouraged you to do.
I think it's very easy to look at social media and get the impression that the latter is very much what's happening, that people have a very binary, very reductive view of what's going on. But social media actually is only a tiny percentage of what's going on out there. And, there is more nuanced thinking going on. I would be lying if I said I don't sense an impatience in voters. But that has to do, I think, with the length of time for which they have demanded change and got no change. So the longer that goes on, I think, the more impatient they get for that change to happen. But it is a difficult thing, because effectively you elect a new government and you expect them to change everything in the space of a couple of months. And if it doesn't happen, then suddenly you turn on them and you think, they're no good, let's vote for the next person coming in. I remember I interviewed once someone who had worked on both of Barack Obama's campaigns. And they said that the most transformational conversation they had with a voter was in a county in Illinois that was actually a swing county in a swing state. And they were talking to someone who said, I don't pay that close attention to politics. But what I do know is that a few years ago, I could easily afford my mortgage, had a lot more free time to do the things that I liked, and I was able to put money aside so that my two daughters could go to college when they graduated. And I can no longer do these things. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep sacking presidents until someone comes in and changes that back to what it was. And I know that sounds infuriatingly simplistic, but it's actually a pretty fair it's a pretty fair judgment of the world. You shouldn't have to pay very close attention to every minutiae of policy that goes on. You should be able to see the improvement or the worsening in your life. And unless a government is doing that, then they're not doing their job.
Well, yes. I presume the same feelings all those thousands of years ago as well. But we had some questions earlier from Peter Walsh, and also from Mark Robinson, and also from Sarah Cowley and Robin Stafford. And I was wondering whether one of you could ask your question out loud.
Mark is actually here and has his hand up.
Oh, has he? So I'm so sorry. I missed his hand completely. Mark, over to you.
Hiya. I'm a little bit responsible for this,
You are
fabulous
absolutely responsible
event.
for this.
And I thought it'd be as good as it is. And just to be super clear, I'm a sort of bit of an Alex Andreou fanboy. I've never met the guy, but I don't think this is actually doing him quite justice, this little event we're having. The guy's a polymath. He's an opera singer, he's an actor, he's a director, he's a lawyer, he's you used to be a regulator or something. I mean, so when you actually enter into the world of Podyssey, you're not just entering into the world of Greek myth, you're entering into a world of his intense record collection. So it's an path that you start in one direction and you end up somewhere completely different. And it's absolutely fantastic. So I strongly advocate that everybody subscribes to the Podyssey podcast because it's absolutely fantastic.
Mark, can I say that's very kind, and it's not deliberate. I absolutely promise to you that I'm not driving. The myth is driving completely. I go into it with my own preconceptions of what it might mean, but actually almost on every occasion it has taken me somewhere that I didn't expect.
I mean, I can't remember which particular one. They ended up in Seven Brides and Seven Brothers. I'm just like, what? Yes. and I promise you, I was at dinner last night talking to some friends. And I was talking about the fact that, the people who wrote the Disney classics 50 years ago were trained classicists. They understood the stories that you tell, and that's why they have a resonance. Anyway, that's not. I was just being a bit of a fan too. Lovely to meet you virtually, Alex.
Lovely to meet you.
But I mean, the tragedy of classicism in the modern political world, which is the question I asked in advance, is the fact that charlatans like Johnson have used it to have faux intellectualism, and that undermines classicism in my view. And I've got a son who is studying classics at the moment. And that's the tragedy of classicism in its current political form. I'm currently in Ibiza, being a bit Dionysus myself, so apologies for the anyway, cheers, guys.
As long as it's Greek wine, that's fine.
It isn't.
Nearly.
I know what you're saying, but actually you have to go sort of 3 steps back on that, because the reason classics can be appropriated in that way is because not enough people, I guess, have a knowledge of it to say, that's not what that means. What are you talking about? And so they've become an easy way to look clever to people who, don't know any better. And then you go a step back and you say, why is that happening? Because we're not teaching enough classics in schools anymore. And then you go a step beyond that and you say, why is that happening? And it's because education has been commercialized. We have allowed companies to say, we need 2,000 accountants in 5 years. So you go out, educators, and produce 5,000 accountants for us in the next 10 years. And that has led to disciplines which are more lateral and more creative being devalued. And I see it all the time. The cleverest people I know, without exception, have an unusual education. The cleverest people I know have a mixed kind of non-linear, flitting here and there education that allows them to basically combine different elements from different disciplines and work across them to come up with truly fresh ideas on
But Alex,
anything.
if I can interrupt you, of course, I mean, you have to have the opportunity to go to the right educational establishments that allow you to do that. And of course, as you rightly said, things get very streamlined. My worry is that we've only got about 5 more minutes left. So we're going to have to be really, really quick in answer any of the other questions.
I have one more hand up here.
There's also, yes, absolutely. We'll check, whatever it is, I can't see.
So Helen Dye has her hand up.
Helen.
Thank you. Yes, I'll be quick. Clearly, the stories we tell each other and ourselves are hugely important in creating our reality. And for the reasons that you said, the rise of populism, where there are simple answers to things, and it's actually the sort of masses, if you like, that would really benefit from understanding and engaging with some of not just the sort of Greek myths, but the stories of the ancients, but whether they're Hindu gods or Christian saints or whatever it might be. And yes, we've sort of seen education, as you said, turned into a sort of commercial operation. And here we are gathered here this evening, all going, this is wonderful. And it gives us a sense of perspective and the fact that maybe all is not lost. But how can we, as, interested people here today, take some of this, the learning, so that we keep this alive, we keep the importance of storytelling alive? What are your thoughts on that?
So if I can, I mean, I've resisted so far getting on my soapbox, but you're giving me an opportunity to do so now. There is a reason why Aesop and his fables developed when they did, right? They developed in parallel with philosophy and set themselves almost as adversaries to philosophy. So Aesop is the anti-philosopher. Even etymologically, his name means dark-skinned, and he's the slave of an intellectual, of a philosopher who's called Xanthus, which means fair, blonde. And so even at his conception level, he's set as the anti-intellectual. And that is, I think, because the ancients understood that appealing to reason on its own is not enough. You need minds, but you also need hearts. And those two things need to go side by side, and they need to develop together. You need the argument, but you also need the story. People like stories. People like to be told that something is the right thing to do in a way that does not belittle them, that is not superior to them, that does not tell them they're doing everything wrong. They like to be told things that tally with what they already feel inside. Progressives, I think, all over the world have not understood this. We look at something like, think of that stupid bus with 350 million on its side, goes to the EU every week. Think of that bus. We got so bogged down in what is the right amount. It's not 350 million because we give some, but we take some back. There's a rebate. We get a benefit out of it. So actually, if you do a full, cost benefit analysis, it comes out to only X amount, or actually we end up making Y amount from that. We got bogged down in the detail and we ignored the story it was telling. The story that bus was telling was a different one. The story that bus was telling was that they're taking your money and they're sending it to someone over there. That is the thing that needed to be countermanded. That is the narrative that needed an argument against it. That said, there's not an over here and an over there. We're all together. We are one thing. And by acting as one thing, we get a better deal for everyone. That's the counter narrative that was necessary, not to get bogged down in the accountancy of it and be saying, no, because there's a rebate. And also, if you convert euros to pounds, it depends on the exchange rate, all those ridiculous things that were going on. And the right wing gets that. That's what Trump is doing in America. You can see it all the time. People get bogged down in the detail of the story, in the fiction of it. Are there people eating pets in some town in Pennsylvania? Of course there are not. Of course there are not. He knows it. His audience knows it. They know it's a kind of allegory for something else. And the something else is there are dangerous foreign people coming here and they're basically taking your life and subverting it. That was the narrative that needed countermanding, not whether there are people who eat cats.
Yeah,
so that would be, I guess, my grand conclusion. My grand conclusion is that as progressives, people need to work on the story. They need to work on the narrative. They need to work on the long horizon. They need to be able to tell people the reason we're doing X, Y, and Z right now is because we're driving to that further horizon, which is better, which will be a better life for you. That's what people need to hear.
So Alex, is the narrative, you and I were discussing this,
Yeah.
is just getting the right narrative. And I sympathize entirely with what you're saying, because I was doing a lot of the economic stuff to argue that we should stay in the EU. And of course, that wasn't going down really. People were not necessarily taking this is the narrative of really what
I mean, I'm not saying that that's not necessary. It is essential. You have to be doing both, right? You can't also become a sort of populist yourself and just put out nonsense just because it sounds good. That's not how it works. That is to betray actually the ethics of what you believe in, which is truth and evidence-based policy. So, that's not what I'm suggesting. I'm saying the two have to go together. When you come up with a policy, you have to also, at the same time and from the very start, think, how do I tell this story in a way that people will accept it?
So this is really where the myths come back to the link that we were just talking about. Is the way of the story, is what it actually tells you.
Yeah.
But also, I think it needs to be done in such a way that people engage with it, understand it, but also learn from it to a considerable extent. And I think that's what I think we discussed a lot of today in terms of what the implications are of particular stories, and perhaps how the Greeks interpreted them. But also, I think where we have the problem, although the myths and the ancient plays and so on told us quite a lot, is that some of the things don't last forever. I think you mentioned that before, and that things can change. And I think there was a question or a comment in the chat about how do we get prepared for change? How do we adjust to this? What does it require? The narrative by itself isn't going to do it, so there's more. So I think it would be very important to take that up a bit more. But I'm well aware that a number of people who had put questions there didn't necessarily put their hand up today to ask the questions. If anyone wanted to, because we're nearing the end, you're very welcome to do so, whether it's Peter Welsh, or whether it's Robin, or whether it's Edna. So Robin, great. Very quickly, you've got 20 seconds.
Very quickly, Alex. Firstly, I've listened to your many podcasts over the years, so thank you for all of that. And I think it is a bit of a cheap shot, but you've already mentioned Donald Trump and what parallels there might be there. I thought you might bring up King Midas as such an obvious one, but would you like to pick one or two other, both national and world leaders who immediately strike you as have parallels in Greek myths?
Yes, and before you answer that, sorry about it.
Yeah, go on.
Anyone else as a final comment? Do you see any other hands, Alex, that I'm not seeing? No? Are we okay?
No.
Right. Okay. Robin, you had the last question. And then, of course, I will, in the end, thank everyone, particularly sort of Mark, whose idea it was to bring you here. But I would have got to that myself, but perhaps it would have taken me a bit longer to get to that point. So, Alex, answer Robin.
So I will go back to Boris Johnson because he likes to always refer to himself in these sort of terms. And I would say that the most appropriate myth actually for him is the myth of Phaeton. Phaeton or Phaethon was the son of Helios, who was the sun god. Helios was responsible for driving the sun chariot across the sky every day, basically, and then he would rest and Selene would take over with the moon chariot during the night. Now, Phaethon felt that as the son of Helios, the job belonged to him quite rightfully. He was made for it, and he would be absolutely brilliant at it. So he kept pestering his dad, let me drive the chariot, let me drive the chariot. Helios kept saying, you're not ready for it, you're not ready for it. One day, he steals the chariot and drives it across the sky so badly that he creates the deserts by driving too close to the Earth and the polar caps by driving too far from the Earth on other spots. And it gets so bad and so chaotic and so threatening to humanity that Zeus has to strike him down with a lightning bolt. That is who Johnson is. The man who thought he would be utterly brilliant at the job the entire time, and then gets to the job and finds out that actually he doesn't know what he's doing, and he's going to cause an awful lot of damage, and yet he won't stop. He still has to drive through the full circle.
Well, that's
Thank you.
Extraordinary. People are clapping. Of course, we have to be a bit careful. But yeah, absolutely fascinating, Alex. So Georgie, we come to the end, I think. Is that right?
Yeah,
if everyone can undo themselves, or whatever it is, if they're still there, if they want to show themselves.
We probably should draw it to a close in a minute, unless somebody has a pressing last question, which I think we've discovered that they didn't. But if anybody does, another second or two. Well, anyway, thank you so much, Alex and Vicky. It really did live up to all expectations and has been, for sure, one of our most thought-provoking and enlightening discussions. So let's do it again at some point. And it also appealed to all ages. We've never had all ages asking questions before. So, and our next webinar is normally announced on the day of the existing one, but we kind of need a few more days to work that one out. So we shall be announcing it in our weekly media review at some point. Please look out for that and keep reading our emails, because they are full of exciting stuff. And if you've enjoyed tonight, we would really welcome your support. We are a charity. Every donation, however small, is gift aidable. So that would be extremely kind. We're a very lean machine. And remember to support Alex by tuning into Podyssey and Quiet Riot Pod. Thank you very much to all of you.
Can I add my thanks to you, Georgie, and to Sophie for getting all that organized, and to all who have attended. And of course, Alex, Efcharistopoli.
Parakalo.
Thank you. So can we all sort of join me in thanking Alex in particular? Thank you very much. That's brilliant.
Thank you. Bless you. Thank you for a lovely, lovely session.